And welcome to another edition of South Texas Now. This is attorney and nurse practitioner Joe Flores inviting you to join us each and every time right here on your favorite station. With me today, I have the privilege of not only introducing a great friend, but someone who has really made a mark. In my opinion, I'm sure he'd disagree because he's a modest guy. But as a federal magistrate and a law professor, and who knows what else he's doing. I'm going to ask if he's going to do his memoirs here in a minute. But we have a special and unique chance to learn behind the curtain what goes on in the federal courts, what's going on with the war on drugs, what's going on with sentencing. And these are the things that we need to really discuss and talk about. And so I welcome my dear friend, Brian Owsley.
Good to see you again, Joe. It's always a pleasure to be here.
I'm so used to saying Your Honor, and but now it's Professor. How do you like being a professor?
I really enjoy it most days, right? I mean, nothing's perfect, but one of the things that when I was on the bench that I wanted more of was interaction with young people. I had one law clerk a year. And I viewed that sort of as my student for a year. And I guess I wanted more students. And so now I have probably more students than I can handle. But it's a joy. We just got full accreditation at the UNT Dallas College of Law. So everyone's excited about that. That's great for us. That's great for our students. And so we are now, I think, in our 8th year. So
That's great.
About to graduate. I think our first class is coming up on their 5th anniversary. So we're moving along, and we're putting out attorneys who, in my opinion, often are doing very good things in their communities. A lot in Dallas, but throughout the state of Texas and beyond. And so very exciting.
Because of COVID and law education, those out there that are watching us that want to become lawyers, and how has technology changed and how has COVID affected your style of teaching?
So, one, COVID has been a problem, I think, as we've seen, education from elementary school all the way up to the university setting. Each student is different. Each professor is different, but I think it's been very hard for everyone to learn as effectively as we did prior to COVID. Fortunately, knock on wood, I think we're seeing sort of at least where we're going to be more normal or more like it was before. So I think that Zoom. The existence of Zoom, which I had not heard of until like March of 2020,
tell me about it.
was good in many regards, but it's difficult to teach a class of 40 or 50 students via Zoom, whether you're all remote or whether some are remote and some are live. It's just difficult. The technology's good, but it's not perfect, and sort of like people forget to unmute themselves. People can't hear you when you try to interject and things like that. So I'm looking forward to maybe sort of putting Zoom aside. I think Zoom, like I said, I think Zoom has been a godsend. I appreciate it. I will continue to use it. For example, I think it will enhance the ability to have one-on-one student meetings sort of when we get to the new normal, because then students can meet, when they aren't necessarily in the building. And I think that's great because, I think meeting with the students is essential and good for their development to help them understand, things that they find confusing or something like that. So I will use Zoom going forward, but I'm looking for the day when I have all my students sitting in the classroom and in front of me and we're just going live.
And some of those, are we having some classes with students in the classroom?
So I've been teaching because I believe in live learning. I've been teaching live since, I guess it's the fall of last year.
Yes, sir.
whatever. But at our law school, and every law school is different, every college is different, just like every sort of secondary school is different. But at our law school, there was sort of options. So every professor could decide whether or not she or he wanted to teach live or via remotely via Zoom. And so, like I said, I always opted to do live. Then every student has the ability to select whether to attend live or to attend remotely via Zoom. And I think, as we first started, more people were staying remote, and no doubt in part because I think that was pre-vaccine and things like that, and there were concerns about that. But there's a convenience factor that I think students opt into. Mm-hmm. But a number of them, in talking to them and sort of as we've continued down the road, a number of them have sort of acknowledged that learning remotely is not probably conducive to their ability to learn as well as they can. So they've gone the route, more and more students have gone live to the extent that they can. Now, the problem is we still have the hybrid approach, and so there's still that crutch. I'm looking forward to when we can just take that away and they got to come.
Yeah.
It may be a little bit paternalistic, but I think, there's lots of studies that talk about sort of live learning and remote education not being optimal. There's places for it, and I know that some people do online programs even prior to the pandemic. But many of our students, I don't think that's the best way for them to learn.
I agree. I taught health sciences, and I'm a brick and mortar guy. Yeah. And when I had to start teaching Blackboard and all that stuff live, you didn't have Zoom, so it's all discussions and typing, and it's so ineffective. Yeah. What's your favorite topic to teach?
So I'd probably say federal criminal procedure.
Really?
It's just my love. I also, these days, I teach a number of things, but this semester I'm teaching federal criminal procedure, but I'm also teaching criminal law. And I always love teaching 1Ls, mostly because they're not fully jaded yet.
So, and for those out there, that 1L means you are a first-year law student, and I believe it. At the 1Ls, the first year, they scare you to death. The second year, 2Ls, they work you to death, and third year, they bore you to death. So that was what we used to say in law school, but that's not necessarily true. But I find because of your experience on the bench, I really wanted to really get into the meat and potatoes of how the federal criminal system, your view now that your lens looking out past and the years that you were on the bench, what is your view of the federal criminal system in general?
Well,
I know that's a very broad.
Well, very broad, yeah. I think it's a system made up of human beings, and so the system is only as good as the people who are in it. And let's be clear. Let's talk about the courthouse that's down the road. The federal courthouse. There's lots of good people in that building who are working hard. Now, in this day and age, I think, from my perspective, I have philosophical or political differences, maybe with some people how they want to handle criminal justice matters. But I think generally, people are trying to do a good job and trying to be fair, whatever that means to them, right? And so now, is it perfect? No, it is not perfect. Are there some significant flaws? Yes, there are. One of the things we're going to talk about today is sort of sentencing guidelines. I think there's some issues with that. It was an attempt by Congress back in the day to try to create a fairer system. And I think the problem is again, it's made up by human beings, and so there are biases and flaws that go into it. But that was the intent of the sentencing guidelines. And I think reasonable people can disagree as to whether or not, or how well that goal was met, or how effective it was.
So, when we talk about drugs, especially when crack hit the streets and all of that, the crime bill, and everybody, has a short memory and says, oh, really? Clinton was, in there when that happened, And I'm thinking, okay, crack hit the streets, so a rich man could buy, powder cocaine, and he'd get a slap on the wrist compared, if he was white, affluent, perhaps he'd get a different treatment, maybe. Maybe. Then a African-American or Latino or poor white that had rock cocaine. Yeah. So what's the difference in sentencing?
The disparity at one time, I think, was 12-1 or 20-1. It was a significant, so comparable weight would yield much higher sentences. So, as you noted, there was some sort of socioeconomic bias built in. I don't know if you remember when Whitney Houston was asked about whether she used crack, and her response was, crack is whack, right? But, I mean, basically, on some level, she was like, that's a poor person's drug. I'm not poor. I'm rich. I can afford cocaine, essentially. Yeah. And as you noted, if you are arrested and charged with cocaine, you are going to have a much higher success rate in terms of reducing the amount of time you'll spend in jail, if at all.
Powder
cocaine. Yes, but I also think, I mean, let's assume, or not assume, but appreciate that. I think also we view crack cocaine as a worse drug, although it's just cocaine in a different form and a different delivery, and so it's the. So, and the point I was going to make is, like, you can have people who maybe are arrested with powder cocaine who will get a slap on the wrist, maybe some treatment, and whereas maybe judges and the system weren't as forgiving for people who would get caught with powder cocaine. Maybe they were looking at time in jail in a way that the person with powder cocaine would get treatment.
The persons with rock,
crack cocaine.
Crack cocaine
versus powder cocaine.
Because the connotation, and also, the culture, the music, everything about romanticizing the whole issue, and it's so highly addictive. We've got about a minute left, but I just wanted to ask you a quick question on your views of, we're now talking prescription medication that has been removed from the market the last 7-8 years. Yeah. What is it in the last minute we've got before break? What are you seeing on there? So, I mean, when I was on the bench, I thought and this is probably my own bias, my scourge was meth, right? Which is, as you know, a extremely harmful drug, and in many ways, at least in my eyes, supplanted crack cocaine. Now I think the scourge is fentanyl, right? And using fentanyl which is a legal drug, to basically cut heroin, and we see, on a regular basis, this person died of overdose due to fentanyl and whatnot. So, and that's sort of, I think, the lead of a number of sort of what I guess would be drugs that are prescription drugs that are now OxyContin and the like, that are being used in ways that are illegal and harmful. Well, you're listening to former federal judge, magistrate Brian Owsley, now a law professor at the University of North Texas, and doing a great job there. We're going to take a brief break. When we come back, we're going to talk more about the war on drugs.